Let's meet our guest. She is a writer and professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, Lara Bazelon.
Thank you for having me.
He served as a public defender for close to a decade here in New York and is the co-founder and director of Zealous, Scott Hechinger.
Good to see y'all. Good to be here.
Thank you both for joining us. It's been a wild week on the criminal justice front. As we're recording today, the prosecution has just wrapped their case in the Derick Chauvin case. Derick Chauvin, of course, is the officer who killed George Floyd, setting off the largest wave of protests in American history last summer. We are days out from the latest, Daunte Wright, who we have camera footage of him being killed, apparently accidentally, by a police officer who says she thought she was using her taser. And we're also, I think, still only a few days out from Lieutenant Caron Nazario, who was again filmed having two guns pointed at him by police officers while dressed notably in his Army uniform and aggressively told to get out of the car lest he ride the lightning, which is a euphemism for being electrocuted, they say. So if we weren't already in the middle of a national conversation about criminal justice reform, we're certainly in it now. And so I want to start by asking the both of you where you think we went so wrong.
Where did we go wrong? I mean, how much time do we have?
We have approximately 1 hour.
Where we went wrong, I mean, we could start at the fact that our current police system was founded on from slave patrols. We could talk about how our current system of incarceration and criminalization and punishment, predominantly and disproportionately of Black and brown people, has a direct line to slavery. Most recently, we can go to the fact that we continue this conversation about reform of a system that is unreformable, whether it's police. We've tried reforms, and we still have 990 police shootings in the last year. When we talk about reform of criminal laws, and we still have literally too many laws, things that are criminalized to count. We've tried that reform. When we talk about improving conditions within jails and prisons, what we're doing is really kind of putting patches on a system that was designed to oppress. It says, and people say that want to continue and perpetuate it, that police and that criminalization and that prosecutions, that incarceration, these are the things that get us to public health and public safety. But if you look at the data and you look at and if you talk to the human beings who are targeted, the opposite is true. Police don't make us safer. They're spectacularly bad at preventing crime and solving crime. They actually make us less safe. Same thing with prisons and jails. And the mistake that we continue to make, therefore, is that we keep talking about reform. We keep talking about, changing the system when it's clear we are in dire need of transformation. And to get to that transformation, we need to stop using the word reform. We need to stop taking the words of police and prosecutors and pro-carceral forces as gospel. We need to think outside the box and have patience for something that seems radically different or seems radical. But actually, when you look at the data and statistics, the opposite of what we have right now is as rational as you could possibly imagine.
Lara, I want to ask you about that, because a lot of people hear, oh my gosh, police abolition, defund the police. This is a bridge too far. And I think it's because there is a lack of understanding about the kind of statistics and real life outcomes or efficacy of a criminal justice system that is really at a step with what we think of it as from watching Hill Street Blues, dating myself, Law and Order, or whatever it is the kids are watching these days. So what is it in your experience that brings you, assuming that you kind of share the conclusion that Scott just articulated, that kind of brings us to this tipping point where we're having such a serious conversation about whether there is a such thing as reform that's possible as opposed to something that's a more significant overhaul?
Well, to start, I do agree with Scott, and I would even stretch it back farther and talk about how the police behave the way they behave because the U.S. Supreme Court has told them that it's perfectly okay for them to do the things that they feel like they can do every day, including conduct pretextual stops, for example, in the hopes that they'll find guns or drugs and a reason to actually arrest the person. It's not completely clear in my mind that that's what was going on with Mr. Wright, but it's certainly a possibility. And so they've been acting for decades with the understanding that there's really not very much of a constitutional check on their behavior. And then you talk about how they're perceived by communities. I mean, I think, and this is obviously a gross overgeneralization, but for many affluent white folks, the police are there to keep them safe. The police are people to be trusted. The police are there to solve crime. Brianna, all the things you were talking about when you think about, for example, Detective Olivia Benson in Law & Order SVU. And then for communities of color, a lot of them are looking at the police and thinking, can I survive this encounter? And as we're seeing, the answer is often no. And one thing that's been so shocking and sad about the Chauvin trial is the incredible victimization. And by that, I mean every single witness who testified who was a bystander looking at the police basically killing someone in front of their eyes and feeling like not only could they not intervene, but who were they actually going to call because this was the police. So I think because of these viral moments, people who generally have not had to engage with this issue or have treated claims about unfairness in policing with great skepticism are really forced in this very visceral way to confront that bias and really understand that it's not just statistics, although the statistics themselves are shocking. So, for example, in San Francisco, you're 7 times more likely to be arrested if you're Black. You are 10 times more likely to be convicted of a crime. You're much more likely to be convicted of a serious crime, more likely to be held without bail. And I think for some people who've been sort of seeing these as statistics and things that they can move past, they no longer really can because it's just right up in their face.
And that's in a state like California and in a city like San Francisco, which we think of as a liberal bastion. So to the extent that kind of motives or politics are perceived to be driving some of these outcomes. You know, when we talk about, people say, oh, the South, and it's racist and all of this kind of stuff. No, we're talking about these kind of outcomes from perhaps the bluest part of America, at least in our mind's eye, and the home base of our VP, who many, I think, were thinking might have a balancing influence on Joe Biden as the protests were raging over the summer. And many argued that part of why Joe Biden even selected Kamala Harris in the first instance was to say, okay, this is responsive in some way to what's going on in the world. We're going to have a Black VP. And many on the left thought, well, let's look at the record and character of that particular human being, regardless of her racial demographics. And in fact, perhaps she is the least ideal choice for the moment. Have either of you made much of the response from the current administration to this last volley of incidents as we've had over the past week?
I mean, I can speak more broadly than to just the administration's response, and going back to this concept or this idea, misperception that the system is horrible and racist and broken only in red states and led by conservative Republicans. You don't have to look any further than just this last year during COVID, when we have this health crisis that brings us, that should be a time when we're all, coming together and understanding, the common experiences that we're having, a way for people to actually recognize what's happening in jails and the experience of being in a jail more than ever before. I mean, think about it. Think about how terrifying it is, at least for me, I'll just say, it's terrifying to walk outside without a mask. It's terrifying to be in close quarters until at least I'm vaccinated. In jails and prisons, in blue states, just as much as red states, people are packed like sardines. Symptomatic people are with asymptomatic people. They're not getting PPE. Yeah. And this is in Governor Cuomo's New York. This is in Governor Whitmer's Michigan. This is in Newsom's California. Unfortunately, I think progressive leaders, they get a pass all too often, because there's this assumption that, like, well, they're liberal and they do great things, in all these other areas. And so they must be better or must be good when it comes to criminal justice. But it turns out even when they're better, they're only slightly better. They're only tinkering slightly more. And so, I think it's not just like an administration thing. It's a perception thing, kind of nationwide, and it's reinforced, I think, a lot by the press. The press give certain leaders, they let them off the hook when they really shouldn't.
Lara, you have been someone who has been willing to be more critical, I think, and at a time when a lot of people weren't being especially critical of Kamala Harris's criminal justice record. And I'm curious what the response has been and whether you think kind of the protest and the George Floyd movement, the George Floyd protest as a whole, have meaningfully changed how people start coming to this issue and whether or not it's radicalized the broader public.
It's certainly radicalized a broad swath of the public, and in particular, I think young people. And it was really interesting this summer just to see the different demographics who were engaged in these massive protests across the country and across the world, really, because that video of George Floyd's life being extinguished was so undeniably horrifying. I guess the question really is, how much staying power does that have? Because you've got to bring people to the table, including, for example, as you point out, the Biden administration, which really, when it comes to criminal justice reform, is quite centrist. And so, just to give you one example, and I think this was also true of the Obama administration, the judicial nominations were very, very disappointing, in that we just saw, first of all, a lack of real shoulder to the wheel to push through some of these nominations, dropping people who were perceived as perhaps too far to the left and nominating a lot of former prosecutors and partners at big law. And there's been a push recently to have the Biden administration really think differently, and they have put forward some names that are exciting. But when you think about the way that the left has addressed the judiciary and how incredibly important these lifetime appointments are, and you contrast it to the way that the right has addressed these appointments, there's really no contest. And I think the right is just utterly apologetic in pushing through people who hold fast to their point of view, which is deeply, deeply conservative. And on the left, you have, I think, this fear of somehow alienating a large part of the voting bloc, and this impulse to appease by appointing people who aren't going to be particularly controversial or even particularly interesting or particularly progressive. And that's very, very unfortunate. That's just one example where I'm hoping that the Biden administration learns from the Obama administration and is less fearful.
I think a lot of folks, and I remember thinking this when you wrote your piece about Kamala Harris not being a progressive prosecutor, and I guess it was February or so of 2019. And I wrote a piece shortly thereafter about some of the similar themes. And some of the response I remember getting was a bunch of folks who didn't really appreciate what the standard status quo role of a prosecutor is. And I think in the public imagination, because perhaps of some of these shows, there is this idea that prosecutors are generally good guys and public defenders are kind of slime balls who are, taking on, representing the worst among us and, bad at their jobs and, the stereotype and the narratives. And so to even start to have a conversation about how someone is not only not a progressive prosecutor, but the kind of default status of the prosecutor and their role as enforcing all of the negative aspects that we understand when it comes to over-policing, was like a first hurdle that I didn't really realize I was going to have to jump as I was communicating as a journalist with a broader audience about why we should be skeptical of prosecutors being put in these positions, set up for these judicial positions as opposed to public defenders. Can perhaps, Scott, can you talk a little bit about, as a public defender, how you respond to those stereotypes and what it's like in real life on the ground, and what the posture of being a public defender is like in the States?
So going back to Law and Order, there's this perception that has been built up over time, beyond even who public defenders are and prosecutors are, about the way our system operates. It operates actually, people think you go to trial, you have the opportunity to have a trial like Derick Chauvin. When the reality is cases rarely if ever make it that far. 95% of convictions come from guilty pleas. And why do they come from guilty pleas? Because of all the laws and practices that intersect to devastate people who are brought into the system. I meet people within 24 hours as a public defender. I met people within 24 hours of arrest, this extremely traumatic experience. And keep in mind, when we're talking about, police shootings, it's the ultimate form of violence. But an arrest itself, putting handcuffs on someone, throwing them into a police car, bringing them to a police precinct, holding them for up to 12, 24 hours in a cell, and then shipping them to central booking, where they then hear a person calling out their name, and it's another white male in a suit. I realize they've already been through all that. And at that moment, they've already not only been attuned to think of public defenders as cogs in the wheel, not supporting them, but have likely had experiences where the outcomes have not been good, where guilty pleas have happened. And it's not because more often than not, public defenders not doing their jobs well. It's because of things like pretrial detention, where you could fight your case and be locked up pretrial and bail that you can't afford, or you can plead guilty and go home. And I found that often, in these first moments, at the earliest point of the case, when no one knows what the heck is going on, the forces, even when someone was innocent, even when someone was stopped and frisked unconstitutionally, the power to plead just to avoid jail was so powerful that tons of people pled guilty on that first day. Things like mandatory minimums, even if you make it past that initial hurdle, the fear of going to trial and facing a mandatory minimum of, let's say, 3.5 years, simply for being in a car, or simply for being in a car where someone happens to have a gun and it's not even yours, or for walking down the street and bullying behavior. A 16, 17-year-old steals another 16, 17-year-old's phone, and the judge could be your mom, and they still would have no discretion to sentence you to any less. Like those power, that coercive power to plea suppresses truth, drives the system, keeps people from going to trial. It has the impact then of sending the message that defenders are cogs in the wheel, and it insulates all the bad conduct that prosecutors engage in, that create this coercive environment. So what you have is this system that just grinds people through the system, where prosecutors are just using all the laws at their disposal to kind of silence the truth, exact guilty pleas. Public defenders, even in well-resourced offices, are still coming up with, slightly better results, more alternatives to incarceration, maybe slightly less sentence years, less people locked up pretrial. But the outcomes are still horrible because the system was designed that way. That then paired with a media that portrays prosecutors as the good guy and public defenders as shoeless idiots who are just cogs in the wheel, operate to create and perpetuate the system that we now have.
And another piece of it, and I don't mean to belabor this point, but another piece of it, as from the perspective of someone who went to law school, remembers kind of the narratives around why one would go to be a prosecutor versus a public defender, seeing people kind of get off the firm train and go be a prosecutor, and the revolving wheel that kind of exists there. The perception that prosecutors are kind of these noble crusaders, as opposed to what my experience was, which was people who understood that this is a thing that you can do to get trial experience and then get a higher paying job afterward, after this kind of revolving door, was really jarring to me. And I remember one of the most formative moments of my law school career going to a panel that was put on by the Black Law Students Association, where they had a current prosecutor and a former prosecutor speak. And the current prosecutor goes first. He's like a young, charming, they're both Black guy, who says, well, I know it's hard and the system is unjust, but I feel like I'm working from the inside. And, it's better me than nobody. And at least I can exert some kind of influence in my department. But he was relatively junior, and I think speaking a little bit out of naivete. And I believed him. When he went first and he spoke, I thought as a 20-something, 20-year-old or whatever, That's right. Work within the system. Do what you can. Of course. Then the old grizzled guy got up and he says, well, that's how I used to think. And then I realized that there was a way that my existence, my presence as a Black man was being used to justify the equity of a system that I understood firsthand was fundamentally unjust. And he recalled a moment during which I think it was his co-counsel, he said, basically gestured to him and made the case tacitly or maybe even a little explicitly that this Black guy made it and he's sitting here in a suit and he's a prosecutor. Why can't the defendant have risen above all of her circumstances in the same way? And that was like a real lightning bulb moment for this guy. And it frustrates me sometimes that when we're having these conversations about kind of the history and backgrounds of these judges, there's very little conversation about what it means for all of these judges, even people that we kind of like Sotomayor, all have a background as prosecutors. And there are very, very few public defenders who ever get chosen for those roles.
You know, I do think it's worth belaboring this point because there's so many misconceptions and they make me crazy. I think public defenders are reaching a moment of having a moment where it's finally somewhat sexy to be a public defender. So when I was a federal public defender, it was widely perceived to be a road to nowhere. People in my family were so embarrassed, they would tell people that I was a prosecutor. All of the stereotypes that you and Scott were bringing up were absolutely attributed to public defenders at large. And the truth of the matter is that if you have a well-funded public defender's office and bright, motivated public defenders, they are some of the best lawyers in the United States. And I say that because the deck is stacked against their client. I don't care what the prosecutor says about how heavy their burden is. It's not. The presumption of innocence doesn't exist in reality. In reality, the jury files in, they look at your client, and they think, I wonder what he did. They're not thinking, who is this wrongly accused person sitting here? And so they have an incredible
And that's if they got there.
And because of that, they have to be unbelievably creative and fierce and ferocious. And that's also because the system is set up to have everybody in it despise them and treat them really badly, which I can tell you, I can't even tell you, we're not here long enough for me to talk about the amount of abuse that my colleagues and I had to put up with from judges and prosecutors on a regular basis. And so I do think it's worth pointing out just how talented and creative and fierce advocates, public defenders can be, and also how important it is to elevate them to positions where they're judges, because they're going to have an understanding that the average prosecutor is not going to have. And I think it's really important to have diversity along those lines in the same way we want other kinds of diversity on the bench, diversity along race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation and age and geography. You want diversity of professional experience, particularly when it comes to, I think, the most serious and weighty thing a judge can do, which is look at the person in front of them and decide what sentence they should get.
It's not just diversity, it's also proximity. I mean, it would be the best thing in the entire world would be if there were more formerly incarcerated people that were not only allowed to go to law school, but be barred, and you don't have to be barred in certain places to become judges, but more formerly incarcerated or directly impacted people as judges. Public defenders, though, have as much, closest proximity as possible. What public defenders also have is a view of how the law actually operates on the ground. The Supreme Court, federal courts, federal judges, state Supreme Court judges, they have this sense that, the law, the law it just operates in a different way. And when in reality, for example, there's in the Fourth Amendment, it says there's this thing called the Exclusionary Rule. And the idea is if you're a police officer and you violate someone's constitutional rights in the process of trying to obtain the evidence gets excluded. In most cases, the case would get dropped. The reality is on the ground, and defenders know this well, that A, most cases never make it that far to a suppression hearing. And so the exclusionary rule actually doesn't really apply in practice. And B, police officers lie all the time. Prosecutors continue to rely on lying police. And judges at the trial level will kind of rubber stamp this. And so that's just one example of the way that public defenders not only have the proximity and kind of as close as possible, can at least feel the bristling, like know the families, feel the bristle when a person is sentenced or bail is set. go to jail, are separated by 6 inches of glass or metal mesh in some cases, but can smell the fear, and can feel the human impact of this. But on top of that, also see how the system operates in practice. And that's just a critical proximity that does not exist currently in the judiciary enough. You
had asked for some examples, and here's just a few. I was asked to write a piece recently, which I titled, "Are Judges Really That Awful?" Yes. And I went through and talked about some examples, and I was asked to write it because I have a book coming out next month that features a fictional judge who's a racist, sexist pig. He's just odious, and he's so terrible that early readers suggested that I sand off the rough edges because he wasn't believable. And what I wanted to try to get across is that half the things that came out of his mouth were actually said to me in real life. And I say that as a cisgender white woman, so you can only imagine what it's like if you don't carry around that privilege. But here's just a few things that they have said to me. One judge screamed in a packed courtroom, "Honey, did you hear what I said?" Leading to just complete silence. And basically, I had been trying to make a record, understanding that I was going to have to go up on appeal, but he wouldn't let me finish my sentence. On the morning of a trial, a judge accused me of stripping in his courtroom. It was hot. I was taking off my jacket. I was wearing a Talbot's sweater set underneath, so not stripping. I had one judge tell me, "I have 2 daughters, a nice one and a feisty one. Guess which one you remind me of?" That was after I was sent back there to apologize because I came to court without that suit jacket because I'd left it in a different courtroom where my client had just been convicted. And I was red-faced because I was crying, and he didn't like either one of those things. And then when I wasn't contrite enough, that's what he told me. And then the absolute worst is that I had a case where my client was facing life. And in the middle of my cross-examination of the state's key witness, the judge told me in front of the jury to sit down and shut up. They hung, and afterwards one of the jurors said, "I just don't think that you got a chance to put on a defense. I didn't feel comfortable convicting him."
Wow. Yeah, I think for the not, like, I don't want to belabor this, but when you're watching TV, I remember I never was a big fan of lawyer shows, but after I went to law school, like while I was in law school, I remember immediately just finding them to be repugnant. I could not watch. I think Suits came out that year around the time I started law school, and watching the first episode in which the guy like doesn't even go to law school. It's not, I mean, that's not my own cross to bear, but he managed to like sneak in somehow without ever going. He forges documents or whatever. And of course he lands at the firm as a fake attorney on his first day and is like tasked with solving the biggest case of the year and like running this trial all by himself. And there are many reasons why this frustrated me. But one of the biggest reasons that TV shows frustrate me is because I think there's not quite a fulsome understanding of how much that happens in the courtroom is rising and falling on these discrete decisions being made by a judge that can be incredibly idiosyncratic, but have enormous evidentiary consequences. Enormous. Not to mention some of the rulings that, about whether or not, prosecutors notoriously, to your point, Scott, will delay or fail to disclose evidence, turn it over at the last minute. Challenges are overruled. Perceptions of what is what prejudice results and who it militates in favor of are extremely biased, and all of these things really weigh and fall on some of the individual caprice and individual biases of judges who are often older, often former prosecutors, and are just human beings. And there is no recourse. I mean, obviously you can appeal, but now you're just with another judge. And there's such limited recourse, and it's difficult to convey the extent to which it's from the top down. Lara, you said earlier, you referenced the fact that there are all of the Supreme Court infrastructure of rulings that are making it so that the outcomes are so often unjust when in the context of police misconduct. And as we're watching the trial of Derick Chauvin right now, there is a lot of media that says, okay, this looks like a slam dunk case. Like, look, the testimony that's coming out looks really favorable to the prosecution, because you have people like the police chief saying, Derick Chauvin's actions weren't part of our training. This violates departmental policy. This isn't a reasonable use of force, stuff that seems to go right to the heart of the standard. But other people who are, engaging more with the case law understand that there have been instances that are very factually similar where none of this ended up mattering because it's such a series of subjective standards. I wonder what kind of Supreme Court precedents, if any, Lara, you had in mind when you said that earlier.
Oh, there's so many, and I'm sure that Scott can chime in, but I mean, a few that I detest the most. There's a case called United States versus Wren, and that says that the police can pull somebody over under a pretext, basically that the whole reason for the stop, at least in their minds, can be a total lie. If in fact there's some kind of objective reason that justifies it, and if they end up having a quote unquote successful search and recovering some kind of contraband, then they can go ahead and prosecute that person and the evidence isn't subject to the exclusionary rule. Another one that I hate, and when I teach it in criminal procedure, I have to just brace myself before class, and inevitably I end up telling my students, this is going to be on the bar, so I have to teach it to you, but it is trash. Mm-hmm. And that's eyewitness identification laws, which allow in almost any kind of identification, including cross-racial show-up identifications, which are so shockingly unreliable that they're almost virtually guaranteed to have the person select the wrong individual.
So can you explain what those are? What cross-racial show-up identification? Yeah.
Sure. And this is actually it's right up at the top of my mind, because my law students and I just had an exoneration in our clinic where the only evidence against our client was a cross-racial show-up. So I can just kind of briefly describe what happened. Basically, there was a white guy in his 20s who came home late one night, and he was robbed at gunpoint in front of his house by two young Black men. And the robbery lasted less than 2 minutes. And it happened in the near dark. It was like 2:00 in the morning. And when he called the police, what he said was they were young and Black, and the gunman was wearing a gray sweatshirt and blue jeans. And 18 hours later, a few blocks away, they do a pretextual stop of our client, who's wearing a gray sweatshirt and black jeans. And he runs away from them. They catch him. They recover a gun. And then they decide, oh, well, he's Black and has a gray sweatshirt. It's probably him. And so they call the victim and they say, we want you to come down to the police station. We have a suspect that we want you to try to identify. And they pick him up and they bring him down there, and he's terrified. He's so scared he won't get out of the car. He's 20 feet away looking out through the windshield, and he sees one person, my client, no one else. He's handcuffed with police officers on all sides of him. And the question is that the person who robbed you? And he says, yes. And that is the most unreliable kind of identification that you could possibly imagine. And my client, needless to say, actually, other than being Black and male, didn't look anything like the person who actually committed the robbery. The complexion was different. The build was different. And he was 8 miles away in a hotel with someone else. And there was documentary evidence that would have proved that. But of course, his lawyers didn't produce any of that evidence. He was convicted. And for this robbery, he got 60 years with no possibility of parole at the age of 19.
Wow. Wow.
So that's a cross-racial show-up.
The other thing, though, I mean, just, we're talking about these really, extreme cases, right? The horrors of an exceptionally long time when someone's inside, innocent. We're talking about the ultimate form of police violence with George Floyd and most recently Daunte Wright. But the thing that you brought up, Brianna, is this idea of kind of the everyday churn thing that like people don't see, understand, who aren't directly impacted or who aren't in the system, is that so much injustice happens every single day. And it's not just judges, it's prosecutors. It's not just prosecutors, it's court officers. It's the sheer number of cases, when that happen and then they disappear. Short sentences, 2 years, 6 years, 3 days, no time in jail at all, probation, fines and fees. I mean, think about, what if Derick Chauvin didn't asphyxiate George Floyd to death, right? We wouldn't know George Floyd's name. But he would have been arrested, cuffed, charged with the equivalent of petty theft, a crime of poverty. potentially caged pretrial, coerced into pleading guilty, met with short jail time or probation, or at the very least fines and fees he wouldn't have been able to afford, and then a warrant would issue for his arrest. And remember, the warrants were on Daunte Wright's record, which is what they used as justification to hold him even longer. And he would have been spit back right back out. Far worse than when George Floyd entered the system at enormous cost to taxpayers and enormous human cost to him. And that happens to tens of thousands of people. I wouldn't even say hundreds of thousands of people every year throughout the country. And so the thing to keep in mind, like when we're talking about this trial, again, these are exceptional things. A trial in itself is exceptional. Long sentences, where someone's innocent is far too common. But the grind of the system just perpetuates. And so I always try to encourage folks when they're talking about these high profile cases or these long exonerations or these long time, sitting in jail and then exonerated, to think about how much injustice is invisible. We see it right now, injustices as visible as has ever been outside of court. But inside of court, things are just continuing on. And we have to be, we just have to be mindful of that.
Scott, earlier you mentioned exclusionary rules. And it seems to me that there's a widespread perception, not just among laymen, but I would say among police, among prosecutors, I'm sure many judges, that to some degree that's cheating. That's how guilty people get off unfairly, and that I think generates a justification for the police to break the rules, right?
It's hard talking about the exclusionary rule, knowing how it just doesn't even operate like it's supposed to in practice. From the standpoint that police know that they can lie brazenly about a justification for a search and get away with it, to the fact that cases never make it to the point where a public defender can cross-examine that police officer about that claim justification. And even if we get to that stage, a judge is, even in the clearest case, will ignore the law that Lara was talking about, or laws that would work in our favor, distinctions. When we have a slam dunk case, we know there's still an exceptionally small opportunity that the case is that we're going to win. So just say off the bat, this whole idea that the Fourth Amendment even really exists much anymore, if at all, is folly. Beyond that, though, we should all, it's hard for folks that have never felt like they're prisoners in their own neighborhood walking down the street. Like, I know 19-year-olds who are scared to walk to their corner bodega because they're scared of being stopped and frisked unconstitutionally with nothing on them. And so it's this idea of the Fourth Amendment that people in this country should be free from unnecessary, undue police interactions. That's something that we should all, want. And inevitably, that's going to keep some people that might have contraband or might have something from getting caught. And that's, I think, if it actually worked, that would be a price that I think every one of us, whether you're conservative, whether you care about human rights, whether you care about fiscal responsibility, whether you care about the bodily integrity and freedom, we should all be able to agree about. But again, the reality is the Fourth Amendment's out the window if you live in certain neighborhoods. It's just, and you have certain color skin. It's just the reality.
Yeah, the stop and frisk data, I was trying to pull it up real quick. I couldn't find the exact number, but it was like at the height of Bloomberg's stop and frisk, it was like if you were Black or Latino and living in New York and were between the ages of like 15 and 50, you had been stopped. Like there is statistically you were stopped at least like once a year. I mean, there was nobody who wasn't being very directly surveilled. It was not an abstraction. It was a really, oppressive and deeply felt policy, which was part of why it was really remarkable to see so many people willing to accept the candidacy of someone like Michael Bloomberg on a Democratic ticket line, years after speaking at the Republican National Convention and being really the face of one of the most draconian far-right policies that we've seen. But I digress. I apologize for my 2020 primary brain. I'm working on it. I want to ask you from a policy perspective what we should be hoping for, because I remember last fall, there was that leaked tape of Joe Biden speaking with all of the senior members of the basically civil rights infrastructure in America, the head of the NAACP, Sherlyn Ifill, Vanita Gupta, all of these people from the Legal Defense Fund and more broadly. And I remember Sherlyn Ifill in particular asked that Joe Biden, who had just won the nomination, I believe at the time, to implement a number of policies that he could implement via executive order, including certain aspects of the George Floyd Act. And Biden's response was that he didn't want to overuse executive authority as a matter of principle. I suppose what principle that is not entirely clear to me. Are there particular policy interventions that you think that progressives should be hoping and pushing for in particular, given that perhaps there is some leverage that can be gained from all of the public conversation going around now about all these on-camera instances of police violence?
I think it was after the killing of George Floyd, there was a lot of attention around the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which was introduced in the Senate and didn't go anywhere. And that act, if it was passed, has hugely important reforms, including doing away with qualified immunity, which is how, of course, police officers are insulated in almost all cases against getting sued because the standard is so dauntingly high. You have to show there was a clearly established constitutional right and that they were utterly indifferent to it and were on notice that their specific conduct was violating it. That's one of the many things that the act would do away with, and it would institute a number of protections designed to avoid horror stories, tragedies, and actually, crimes, really, like the ones that we've been talking about today. The problem, of course, is that we have the filibuster and you need 60 votes. And as we all know, until the Democrats are willing to do away with that, it's unclear to me what kind of progressive legislation really has a shot at the federal level. And you were talking about Joe Biden talking about not wanting to overuse his executive power. We have the same problem in the Senate with Joe Manchin saying against all reality that he believes in bipartisanship and doesn't want to do away with the filibuster because, as we know, the Senate's been oh so productive in the last 10 years. And so I guess I'm skeptical that we are going to see wide-ranging policy changes on a federal level. And I think really the action is in the states. And that's how I've been feeling for a long time, in the same way that I feel like the action in court is really also in the state courts and not in the federal courts.
What does that mean practically? Sorry, what should we be focused on? Local DA races, or what changes?
Well, let me give you an example. Sure, let me give you an example of what I mean. So, California is not perfect, although it is my adoptive state. We are pretty far out there on the cutting edge when it comes to some reforms, including the fact that there are now not enough, but at least some public defenders who are in powerful positions in terms of being on the bench, for example. So my former boss at the federal public defender is Maria Elena Stratton. She's now a justice on the Court of Appeal in LA. And she just wrote a dissent in a case called Flores that is one of the most eloquent, beautiful dissents that you could ever imagine, talking about the ludicrousness of her colleagues upholding one of these pretextual stops, ratcheting up to probable cause, and talking about how their reason for probable cause was just ingrained in racism and white supremacy. Basically, the reasoning was that instead of straightening up immediately, making eye contact and polite chit-chat, this individual who's a man of color didn't do any of those things. And to them, that was enough to have him be searched and have his car be searched. And her dissent calls them out and then ends with, "Tell that to Eric Gardner." And when I read it, I was thinking, you just need one more Maria Stratton and that dissent is a majority. And I think we're moving in that direction. And that if you put enough pressure on these elected officials and let them know you're here because a coalition of progressive people voted for you and we're going to hold you accountable. And one of the things that we voted for was you appointing people to the bench. We're not just going to be these wealthy, white, older former prosecutors and law partners, but we actually expect something different from you. And we see more people like Justice Stratton. I believe that is going to make a difference. That's just one example. But when I read that dissent, my first thought was, wow, that's one appointment away from a majority.
Well, Scott, did you have a follow-up there?
I was just going to say that there's a limitation to what the federal government can do. And actually, the vast majority of criminal justice laws, policies, practices is in the area of the states. And so that's where we really should be looking. And we're seeing incredible wins, which, in my mind, it's like obvious legalization of marijuana, and not just legalization of marijuana in New York, but legalization in a way that actually provides justice for those communities most devastated by the war on drugs. We're seeing another win recently in New York to limit the use of solitary confinement, which is torture, in New York prisons and jails. In Illinois, we saw a massive win for pretrial fairness in the Pretrial Fairness Act, which ended cash bail and overhauled the pretrial justice system there. So that's bail, that's electronic surveillance. I think it's time for progressive leaders to recognize that if they stand strong and they stand firm and they marshal story and they marshal statistics, about fiscal responsibility, human impact, they can actually make these previously so-called soft on crime policies actually popular. They just need to have courage. They need to have a media. We need to have a media that is, not falling into familiar tropes of only asking police and prosecutors for comments, only reporting on the salacious cases, but actually asking people on the ground, organizers, defenders, for comment. We need to have a populace. Feeds into the obligation, I think, on the part of the media. A populace that has, I said this earlier, patience for change. Last thing I'll say is, some of the things I just mentioned, where it's, cash bail, it's marijuana legalization, it's like the ending of torture. These are things that, are in my mind, in the grand scheme of things, like somewhat low hanging fruit. Like this should be kind of the easy stuff. I don't think we should, as people who, again, care about human beings, who care about public health and safety, who care about fiscal responsibility, who care about outcomes, should stop at the non-non-nons, the non-sex, non-felony, non-violent cases. Because even in cases that are deemed violent, crimes that are deemed violent, we know that prison, which is characterized by the same drivers of violence itself, shame, isolation, economic deprivation, violence, only produce more violence, don't make us safer. We know that police, and we're pouring billions of dollars into them, don't make us safer. They don't prevent crime. And so it's time to start having, just to continue, I shouldn't say start having, continue these conversations and not run from them. And it's really exciting to see a range of progressive leaders, but also just like this groundswell of organizing around the tough stuff, around violence and our appropriate responses to it, and moving away just from very necessary changes like the decriminalization of drugs and, again, the end of torture, to these positions that I think we all, even conservatives, can agree on. I think they check a lot of boxes.
Do you think that these reforms you've been talking about, many of them very, very welcome, and many of them the fruits of success from a reform movement that has been brewing in this country for the past decade, and notching real victories when it comes particularly in local prosecutor races, do you think that overall these reforms are sufficient to address the imbalance in our adversarial system of justice, in the imbalances you both have been talking about over the course of this episode between prosecutors and public defenders? Or do you think there's something that more radical we should be thinking about? Something more like, when it comes to courts, ripping it up and starting again, of building a new, model of resolution.
Yeah, the abolition conversation.
Abolish the courts, in other words, and replace it.
I thought we've been having that conversation the entire time.
My response is, hell no, it's not sufficient. And it's not going to be sufficient until there's a complete realignment of the power structure that is currently in place. And I know we're getting at the end of our time, but one thing I want your listeners to know is that they have a voice in all of this, and they have a role in all of this, which is to say, I always encourage people not to wait their turn, not to worry that because they advocated for a particular cause or sent a particular tweet, they're somehow not going to be in a position to be selected by the powers that be. I think you should run for things. I think that you should put yourself out there. I think that you should join a grassroots campaign's policy team and not count yourself out and not count your causes out, because it's really only when there is a collective movement towards not just promoting these causes, but normalizing them in the eyes of the public that we're actually going to see real change. And I feel like so many people just already are just turned off, and I can understand why. And yet I think there's such hunger for new voices and for new visions, and so much disgust with what's happening right now in our society, and just the murders and the racism and the retrograde policies and the mass incarceration, that there's room for profound change, but people have to be willing to step up and really put themselves in the arena.
And I think, look, I agree with Laura's response, hell no. And I think, though, the goal should be, what I'm looking at is, yes, on the way to abolition, it would be nice to figure out how to strip the system of these laws and practices that make it literally impossible for the system and for the system to be adversarial. It's just not. What I'm looking at, again, is if the end goals, again, are health and safety, the vast majority of things in the system, should not be in the system, right? We should be investing instead in communities. We should be investing in mental health services, substance use, services. We should be, even in those violent cases, we should be recognizing that policing and punishment not only doesn't bring safety and prevent crime, but it also doesn't bring healing to survivors of violence. And so, I'm one of these folks who is not just going to wait to the end. So I wouldn't push off, obviously, things like limiting the use of solitary confinement in the effort to ultimately abolish prison. But the goal, if we want a fair system, we want a healthy system, if we want a safe society, is blow it all up. Not literally, but full transformation. Full transformation. We're not doing it right. We haven't ever done it right. And it's exciting that now there's actually some space to be having this conversation and folks are more willing to listen.
Yeah, where policing and incarceration aren't the only policy tools that are available to solve these complex social problems.
They never have been the only ones. It's just we're starting to talk about them. Yeah,
absolutely.
In some places actually implement them.
It looks like we are out of time, but very quickly, Scott, if you could tell us where people could find you. And also, I'm not actually familiar with your organization, so if you could briefly explain to our audience what you do.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. I'm Scott, Hech. So just really briefly, I served for 10 years as a public defender, and really early on was extremely frustrated by my inability, one client at a time, to even come close to tilting that imbalance of justice. And so started thinking about how I could share my perspective and expertise in my office and other defenders could outside of court in partnership with the people and communities we represented. And out of this work, thinking about non-traditional legal advocacy methods to shift the narrative and change the system, started this organization, Zealous, that now operates nationwide and supports, activates, and trains defenders in tandem with the people they represent, in tandem with artists and technologists and organizers, to get to a place where we get to that transformation, one policy change at a time, one story at a time.
That's right. I'm very excited to hear more from Zealous. And Lara, you have a book coming out.
I do. It's called A Good Mother, and it's a legal thriller. So it's a courtroom drama. You can pretend you're on an airplane going somewhere. Post-COVID, you actually do get to go somewhere. If you can't finish it in 2.5 hours, I have failed miserably. But in light of the conversation we've been having, it centers around a very fierce, flawed female public defender protagonist, which I felt like was sorely lacking in that genre and in the world in general. In the fictional world.
I wonder who that's based on.
I need to get my hands on this. I'm so excited.
It was fun. Oh my gosh, Scott, I'm totally sending it to you right now. It was fun to write. And I'm on Twitter at Lara Bazelon, LARABAZELON.
Is your book available for pre-order right now?
It is available for pre-order pretty much anywhere where books are sold, and it got a nice starred review in Booklist, so I'm happy about that.
Congratulations. That's exciting.
Thank you.
We'll have a
Congrats.
We'll have a link to that pre-order about to be order in the description of this episode. Scott Hechinger, Lara Bazelon, thank you both so much for joining us. This was brilliant. I definitely would love to have you back on, talk more about being a public defender, because I find that to be one of the hardest but most decent jobs in the country, and I'm sure you all have a lot more stories you could tell.
A few.
It was so wonderful to be with you, and Brianna, it was great to see you again. Thank you for having us both. And
it's so
Scott,
good
it was
to
wonderful
see you
to see you too.
Great to see you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank
we really
you.
appreciate it.